Okay, hey, my name is Chris and I want to talk about values today. But I don't want to talk about values in the sense, what do I value? What do you value? I don't want to get political here. I just don't want to open any Pandora's boxes today. No, I want to look at values from a philosophical standpoint. So instead of looking at concrete values, what we value, what we don't value, I want to group these values, look at different constructions of values, group them and see if we can form different categories of values. I actually have 3 categories of values in mind, but we're getting there. So to get there, I give you 2 examples. So if you're a farmer, for example, you might think the rain is valuable, right? If you are in the same place, right? Same time, same place, but you are a tourist on vacation, you might think the exact opposite because you want to enjoy your days off with lots of valuable sunshine, right? So in one case, the rain is observed as valuable, and in the other case, the sunshine is observed as valuable. Same place, same time, right? Total different observations or attributions of different values, right? Sunshine or rain. But even if these 2 values, or what we attribute a value to, seem to kind of contradict each other, right? Usually it's not raining and sunny at the same time, right? They have the way that the values are constructed, they have something in common. The way these values are constructed, they are both instrumental values. Very important. So the farmer observes the rain as valuable because for him it is means to an end of growing his plants, right? Without the water he can't grow his plants, he will lose his harvest maybe, right? So the rain is valuable because it is an instrument, a means to an end for the farmer. The same is true for the tourist who observes the sunshine as valuable, right? For him, the sunshine is means to an end of having a great vacation. So we build the categories of values not by looking at what is observed as valuable, the rain or the sunshine in this case, but we build the categories by looking at how these values are constructed. Very different thing, right? So in these 2 examples that we looked at, what was observed as valuable was observed as valuable because it was an instrumental means to an end. And the philosophical school that constructs values primarily in this way is called Utilitarianism because it's useful for something. Means to an end, instrumental value, utilitarianism. Okay, so that's the first category, instrumental values. Now let's look at another example. When the farmer, or the tourist for that matter, doesn't really matter who, talks about his spouse, for example, he might not think about the other person he loves purely as means to an end. Usually we don't do that, right? But, if you love somebody unconditionally, right? It's not means to an end. It's not instrumentality. You just love the person unconditionally. Completely different category. So you're not instrumental. You're not an instrumental value. You're not creating an instrumental value. You're creating an inherent value. An inherent value is independent of any form of instrumentality. Very, very important. So whatever is observed as valuable is observed as valuable because it has a value on its own, for its own, just because it is, right? You could say it is an end on itself. Not in itself, we're going to get there. I would say on itself because it is an inherent value. It can be means to an end as well. Maybe your spouse is a good cook, right? But primarily you're not loving your spouse because he's a good cook. You're loving your spouse because it's just love, right? Unconditionally. But it can be means to an end. An inherent value can also additional to the inherent value, have an instrumental value, right? On top of that. But if they are not means to an end, right? If your spouse is not a good cook, you still love him, right? They are still observed as valuable because they represent an end on themselves, right? So it's actually very simple. As I said, even if your spouse is not a good cook, you still love him or her, right? Or think of little children, right? You would never, if you have a child, I hope nobody in this world looks at his child or her child and sees an instrumental value, right? That's kind of a little effed up, right? No, you're not loving your child because it's useful for anything. It's not a utility for you. Of course, you love your child unconditionally because it is just your child, right? Inherent value, not an instrumental value, an inherent value. So we had instrumental values and we had inherent values. Means to an end on itself, right? Conditional, unconditional. Both instrumental and inherent values are external values. So whether it is about the rain or the sunshine or the spouse or the child, these are all external phenomena. So we are projecting the value onto something that is very abstractly conceptualizable as a external phenomena, right? An observable thing, basically, in the outside world, so to speak. So we can see the rain, we can see the sunshine, just like we can see and address our spouse or our children. They have a name, they have a body, right? They are there. They are physical beings. There's a phenomena, even if it's raining, it's not like a person, right? But the rain is still there. You can see the drops. It's an outside external phenomena. And then we address this value to that outside phenomena. That's why these values, instrumental and inherent values, are external values, right? Then there's a completely different category, right? We had the external values, instrumental or inherent. And then there's a complete different category, and that's the intrinsic value. Intrinsic values are a little more tricky because values are not attributed, projected onto some outside phenomena, right? There's nothing we can observe in the outside world that we can value, right? Think of health, for example. You might associate health with a nice body or nice skin or whatever, right? Certain behaviors, right? But health is way more complex. Health is an unobservable inner workings, you could say. So health is clearly valuable, but health is not a thing. Health is not a person. There's not something that we can directly observe, like we observe the rain or the sunshine, for example. Or think of happiness or love itself, compassion, or all the unseen processes and inner workings, right? That's why it's an intrinsic value, the inner workings that make the people you love the people you love. You can attribute a value to your spouse, right? When she or he stands there, right? And say, this is my spouse and I value her. That's an inherent value because you attribute the value to the person that is actually there. But your spouse is not just outside appearance, right? There's an inner working. There's an intrinsic working, an inner working, right? That is constituting who your spouse is, why you're loving, right? That's not external things, right? So in systems theory and philosophy, especially in systems theory, the intrinsic value is often associated with the necessary preconditions, meaning all the invisible processes and inner workings that create the outside phenomena, right? That's a little weirdly put, but it's very important to conceptualize it like this, right? So your spouse is not your spouse because the surface of your spouse is so pretty, right? There's an inner working to it, and that inner constitution constitutes whatever you love about your husband, your wife, whatever, your child. That's not just surface. That's not just the thing itself. There's an inner constitution. And this inner constitution is valuable as well because it creates the outside phenomena, right? And that can be used as a value or attributed a value to. So that's the intrinsic value. What does the person you love, what makes the person you love the person you love? What makes the rain rain, right? What makes the sunshine shine? I think that has a value too. Even if we can't quite put our finger on it, even if we can't really describe what makes the rain rain, what makes the sun shine, what makes the person you love the person you love. That's not just outside phenomena. And that's what the intrinsic value is all about. And I think it's very, very important to understand that because it's easy to forget that there's an inner working that constitutes the outer forms. That is kind of the initial necessary precondition for every external phenomena. I don't want to be woo-woo about this. This is systems theory. You can conceptualize this with religion. You can conceptualize this with spirituality. But I try to conceptualize it with philosophy, and in this case, systems theory. Because, people of different religions and spiritualities, they constantly fight. But if you see it from a functional perspective, not from a moral perspective, not even from an ethics perspective, but from a purely functional perspective, you just say how it works, right? The intrinsic value is the most complex value because it is it is kind of compatible with both the inherent value and the instrumental value. So you could say if something is valuable in itself, intrinsically, it can also be valuable on itself, inherently, regarding the outside phenomena. And that can even be instrumentally value at the same time. It can be a means to an end. Maybe your spouse is a good cook, right? So it's very useful, right? Nice to have him around because he's a good cook. But, there's the inner workings that kind of create or constitute your spouse. That is valuable. Why? Because you attribute a value to your spouse. You love your spouse unconditionally. That's the inherent value. And then he might be, in addition to that, a good cook. Nice to have, right? But he's not just a utility, hopefully. So, questions for you, my dear friends. How do you usually construct your values? Are they primarily instrumental? Are they primarily inherent? Or do you keep in mind the intrinsic value as well? So just make a list about what is valuable to you and what you think is a value, and then try to categorize them. What is instrumental? What is inherent? What is intrinsic? Just leave a comment, let me know. Often enough, it's not so clear, because they can stack up, basically, as I said. So the least complex set of values are instrumental values because they're just means to an end. Then the next complex category is the inherent value because it is valuable on itself, but can still be means to an end instrumental value. And the most complex category is the intrinsic value, because the intrinsic value the intrinsity itself, the inner workings are constituting the outer form, the inherence, right? That can be valuable, and then it can still be means to an end. Okay, if you got something out of this, I hope you liked it. Then please like it, like the video, hit that like button, share, like, subscribe. There's even a Ko-fi link in the description box below, so you can support me and the channel. Thank you very much for that. And hopefully see you next time. Now goodbye, my friend. Ciao.